The White House vamping up its communications team today as the battle for the Supreme Court heats up. We are 1 week away from President Trump announcing his nominee for the High Court to replace retiring Justice Anthony Kennedy. This as the president says he interviewed 4 candidates today and plans to meet 2 to 3 more. Trump is rolling up his sleeves, gearing up for a fierce fight with Democrats who are vowing to block his pick.
It's probably going to be vicious because the other side, all they can do is obstruct and resist. You know, the whole thing is resist. But, and maybe someday we'll be able to get along with the other side. I don't know. But right now it's only resist. That's all they want to do is stop things from happening. So they're going to try very hard. But I think it's going to go actually very quickly if I pick the right person.
And this comes amid growing concerns from the left that the new makeup of the court could lead to the reversal of the Roe v. Wade ruling legalizing abortion. The president also weighing in on that in his sit-down with Maria Bartiromo.
Are you going to ask your nominees beforehand how they might vote on Roe versus Wade?
Well, that's a big one, and probably not. They're all saying, don't do that, you don't do that, you shouldn't do that. But I'm putting conservative people on. And I'm very proud of Neil Gorsuch. He has been outstanding. His opinions are, you know, is so well written, so brilliant. And I'm going to try and do something like that, but I don't think I'm going to be so specific in the questions I'll be answering. And I'm actually told that I shouldn't be.
Maine Republican Susan Collins, a swing voter in the Senate, vows to oppose a nominee who would overturn the ruling.
I believe very much that Roe v. Wade is settled law, as it has been described by Chief Justice Roberts. A candidate for this important position who would overturn Roe v. Wade would not be acceptable to me, because that would indicate an activist agenda that I don't want to see a judge have.
Okay, so obviously, Dana, this is a key issue and of concern, you know, both sides talking about this. But the president, in his interview with Maria Bartiromo, was saying that he wouldn't necessarily, you know, ask that specific question. It's not something that he personally is looking for in a nominee.
Right, so conservatives have said that we're not asking for any nominee, this is going back many decades, to say specifically how they would rule on any one issue. What conservatives say that they want is somebody who will rule based on how they, on the strict reading of the Constitution.
Yes.
Not like interpreting, well, maybe the founders could have thought about something good and they didn't understand. And this particular issue of Roe v. Wade is one where even Ruth Bader Ginsburg, I went back and read today, her thoughts about that actual decision being one that was probably outside the realm of what the Constitution was saying. And that's what riled up conservatives about this issue for a long time, is that that decision itself was one that they would look back and say, that was not decided well. Now, that doesn't mean it isn't precedent. Okay, or some people might call it settled law.
Sure.
But so it is going to be a major sticking issue. But go back and look at it. I remember when I was a spokesperson, like Raj Shah, the deputy press secretary, is going to move over and do full-time communications for this nominee. I was a spokesperson for Justice Roberts. I just knew Roe v. Wade kind of based on the general idea of what I knew growing up. But I'd never gone to law school, and I was getting all these questions about the right to privacy. And I remember going to the staff secretary at the time, who happened to be Brett Kavanaugh, and saying, can you help me understand? I thought this was supposed to be about abortion rights, and everyone's asking me about the right to privacy. And he said, it's a great question. Let me walk you through it. And that's when I first understood how the decision was actually made. I do think there's a lot of hysteria around it. However, it doesn't mean that people don't feel extremely passionately. And of course, it's going to rally up the president's base, but it will rally up the liberals' base as well. And I think that the president is right, and he will probably be cautious, and he will say this over and over, that I'm not going to ask the nominee how he or she would rule specifically on this issue. But it will be the undercurrent of all the fights for the next several weeks.
Okay. Mr. Starwalt.
She's right. She's right.
Oh, smart move.
Yeah,
Smart move.
exactly.
Start with that. She's right. Thank you guys for having me here today.
Nice to see you.
Happy Independence Day week. Yay.
Yay. Where's the flag?
For the record. So Quinnipiac University has a new poll out today that looks at Americans' attitudes on this issue. And guess what? Overwhelmingly, Americans don't want to see Roe versus Wade overturned. That's by a 2-to-1 margin, and even a majority among men. So the hysteria here is it's damaging because nobody's saying that. The way that abortion, the way that access to elective abortions has been rolled back in the United States hasn't been by an effort. I'm telling you, you're the lawyer. Hasn't been rolled back through big, we're going to knock it over, it's going to be kaput. Instead, what's happened is states have found ways, conservative states, have found ways to put different limitations on access to abortion. In Texas, in Alabama, there are 20 states or so in which getting an abortion is almost impossible. It's extremely difficult where states have matched the voters in those places and done it. And none of that has had to do with overturning Roe v. Wade.
Right.
It's been about taking the long track back. Conservatives started this 30 and 40 years ago, a long track back to before Roe, when how can we make this a federal issue? How can we make this for the states? How can federalism apply here? And that's what's happening. But what you've heard and what I've read from Jeffrey Toobin and other people that have said that African Americans will no longer be welcome in elite universities, that all of this stuff, it's worse even than the stuff I heard when Robert Bork was the nominee many, many, many moons ago. And it's not good for the discussion, number one. But number two, they're creating a problem for Democrats. They create this monster. They say, well, this terrible, evil human being is going to rise up out of the belly of the swamp and come and ruin your lives. And then this person's going to walk out, and you know what they're going to say? Oh, he seems all right. She seems nice. And that's what happened with Roberts. That's what happened with Gorsuch. These heinous expectations are met with a nice, competent person, and people go, oh, okay.
Wow, it's interesting. Yeah, heinous expectations met with a nice, competent person. So that sounds a lot like it's just the rhetorical hype, the vitriol, Juan. Really, we've seen in the past that this type of thing has happened, and then you see in terms of the person who comes forward, like in the case of Neil Gorsuch, somebody who has been, well respected and admired and complimented in terms of how he's comported himself thus far.
Well, I could make the same argument. Going back to Merrick Garland, he was well respected, highly rated, and never given the opportunity to have even a hearing, much less a vote. But I think the big point here is that we live in different times, Kimberly. I was talking with Abby Huntsman today on Outnumbered.
Right, I saw.
And she said to me, she had Justice Scalia's son on Fox and Friends, and that he said to her, his dad was approved 98-0.
Yep.
Now you think about this. 98-0. He's a qualified, competent jurist with a long record and a clear conservative, and yet not one so-called liberal Democrat voted against Justice Scalia. But in 2018, we live in a situation that's far different in terms of how polarized our country is, and we have a far different president. So my colleagues here on this panel say, oh, but he could be a nice guy. And, of course, Neil Gorsuch was a nice guy. And don't worry about it. They have all these terrible things. My pal Chris Stirewalt comes from D.C. and he says, what's all this black people won't be in elite institutions? Well, affirmative action is a big deal for the Supreme Court. And they set the rules for how schools can consider young people, especially young people coming from underprivileged conditions. But the larger point to my thinking is this, that what you're looking at now is approving a fifth conservative justice in polarized political times, potentially creating a rubber stamp in the Supreme Court for a conservative agenda. And people will say, well, but, President Trump says he's not going to ask about abortion. It's not a litmus test for the conservatives. So let me read you a quote that comes from Donald Trump. He says, that'll happen automatically, in my opinion, because I'm putting pro-life justices on the court. It'll go back to the states, and the states then can make the determination. So this is not a secret to liberals, and it's not a secret to conservatives. He wants justices who will undo Roe v. Wade.
Well, I don't know if he wants to undo, but that pro-life, or in terms of their viewpoints, but he was pretty specific with Maria saying that he wasn't going to ask that question or single it out as one of the requirements versus a constitutionalist that would actually just uphold the Constitution and construe and read the case law.
But he said that during the campaign, right?
Right.
Correct.
Right.
Correct.
So what he said is, I will work to nominate conservative justices. Senator McConnell has worked to confirm conservative justices. then and even if the president never even asked them what the litmus test
That's
is,
the idea
it's
behind
just
The
yes,
Federalist,
I get it.
the
I get it.
Federalist Society.
And it's what
That's the list.
But it is also one of the factors that he campaigned on. And he promised to put justices on the bench like Neil Gorsuch, and that is, widely lauded by the Republicans and conservatives that he put somebody that was in keeping with his campaign promise, Tom.
Also, yes, that's what you want. Instead of going back to what he said during the campaign, look back to Gorsuch. Back to the way that was handled. The president, he has no problem turning up the temperature on issues, but on this issue, I think he approaches things in a fairly normal establishment kind of a way. He's appointing people that I think most people are. He's going to appoint people that most people are comfortable with, and he's probably going to get it passed. It's not going to be 98-0, but he'll probably get it done. And I'm not even concerned by the kind of things that Susan Collins says. The kind of judges that get appointed now are not the kind of judges like in the Judge Bork days that were advocates for overturning Roe v. Wade. Most of them keep kind of mum on their personal views on these things. And so I think it's going to be non-controversial.
All right, we shall see.
Just add one little thing, which is that the left uses the idea of Roe being overturned as the right uses the idea of guns being abolished.
Right.
And it is the way to fire up your base. Neither of those issues are actually on the table.
Right.
But that is what people will use. So we can be calm about the types of judges that are going to get out there and how they might rule, but that the spin is going to be what it is. But the formidable infrastructure around conservative nominees, I think, is really in place because of how Robert Bork was treated in the 80s. And the conservatives figured it out that they are not going to let this happen to another nominee. The Democrats had to do the same thing for Elena Kagan and Sotomayor during the Obama administration. And the judicial confirmations have been a real bright spot for conservatives with this administration. And so I think that the timing is everything in politics, and President Trump seems to have great luck when it comes to
One
timing.
last point on this, which is I hear conservatives say, Roe v. Wade's pretty settled. Chief Justice Roberts says it's pretty settled. So stare decisis, which means that you don't overturn things without cause, is going to hold. But what did we see from Gorsuch? You say he's highly praised, Kimberly. He came on, and I think it's a week or two ago, Chris, he just voted to overturn a 40-year law that had regard to how unions were able to collect so-called agency fees or dues from people who may disagree with their political agenda. He overturned it.
But no one's saying these people aren't
he didn't do it by
conservative,
himself, but
right?
yeah.
No one's saying that
Right.
these people aren't conservative.
Yes.
And these are the kind of justices that any Republican president would be picking because this has been, as Dana says, a 40-year project. This is the most important thing to many, many, many conservatives is retaking control of the Supreme Court, and they have not hidden that.
And that was one of the main deciding factors for many of the people, including evangelicals, a quarter of them that cast a vote on the ballot for now President Trump.